You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 432 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today, I'm talking about impeachment, but I don't want to get lost in that for the whole show because there's a ton of other important stuff going on, including the Senate passing the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, sending it to Trump's desk, where he will sign away another $732 billion of our tax money to the Pentagon and military-industrial complex. There's this looming deadline that Kim Jong-un has imposed, saying that he will resort to testing of his nuclear program if progress isn't made with the Americans by Christmas or the end of the year. And this really sets up a potential crisis like we had in 2017 with Fire and Fury and so many other. And there are tons of other critical news stories across the Middle East that I want to cover. So make sure you share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I also write the daily news roundup there. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it. The show has its own podcast feed and is on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. You can also donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Alright, so impeachment is what everybody's talking about. And of course, there are a lot of important things to say about it. I'm trying not to get into the politics too much. I want to stay focused on the foreign policy aspects, as you know, that's what this show is all about. So the two articles of impeachment that the House passed are for abuse of power and obstruction of justice. The abuse of power claim that the Democrats put forward, this is not what I am saying, but this is what the Democrats argue, is that Trump abuses power by withholding a meeting with President Zelensky of Ukraine and $250 million in military aid that would have gone to Ukraine in order for Ukraine to help Trump score political points against his political rival Joe Biden. And then they say Trump obstructed justice. I believe these claims are related to his refusal of some congressional subpoenas, but Trump made, and I think correctly, the constitutional case that the Supreme Court would have to order him to comply with those subpoenas before he would actually constitutionally need to do so. Most of the attention is paid to the first article of impeachment, which has shifted into kind of a claim of bribery as well, because some of this was the military aid. Now, I think, the big fundamental problem the Democrats make here is that their own witness and their strongest witness, Sondland, the former ambassador, the strongest claim that he could make is that there was like a consensus implied belief that in order for Zelensky to get a meeting with Donald Trump, he would have to open this investigation into Joe Biden, or Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and the company he was working for, Burisma. A little bit more on that later. However, Trump does end up meeting with Zelensky without Zelensky opening this. And then in Ambassador Sondland's testimony, he says that he had just inferred that the military aid that Trump had temporarily decided to withhold was a part of trying to get this investigation in Ukraine. I think Trump had publicly put out in the time that he felt like the European countries needed to accept more responsibility for Ukraine, which is something, pretty much that's been fundamental to Trump's foreign policy, feeling like the Europeans don't pick up enough of the slack for NATO. So it essentially, in the mainstream claim to combat Russian aggression, he's saying that the European countries aren't picking up enough of that to happen. So this fits well into that foreign policy framework. So because of that, I think the Democrats have a pretty weak case here. The whole withholding the meeting for the investigation to Joe Biden is problematic. Part of the reason, though, that this isn't as strong as it even sounds is I'm pretty sure what was going on in Ukraine with Hunter Biden, it was pretty inappropriate. This is somebody who had a history of failure and drug use, who had no experience in Ukraine, no experience working at gas companies, who gets imported to the board of a Ukrainian gas company, paid tens of thousands of dollars a month, millions of dollars in total. And as far as anybody could tell, had absolutely no qualifications for this. And then the other point, the important point there is that his father, Joe Biden, was vice president at the time and was heading up Barack Obama's policy for Ukraine. And so it seems like if a Ukrainian company felt like the Americans had a lot of sway in their country, which they obviously did by orchestrating this coup d'etat, and the new government was heavily supported and relied upon by Joe Biden, and Joe Biden publicly bragged about his ability, to get different people in Ukraine fired, it makes a lot of sense why this company would want to hire Hunter Biden for his connections for his father. That way he could get more, government contracts or permits or whatever in the heavily, heavily corrupt Ukraine. So even though what Trump may have done wasn't necessarily appropriate, it certainly seems like the crime he was investigating was probably a little bit more serious than the crime he has, alleged to commit to have pushed this investigation. Now, I really don't have a problem with impeaching Donald Trump because there's a lot of things to impeach him for. One of the points that Ron Paul kind of famously made during the impeachment of Bill Clinton was that the Republicans were impeaching him for the wrong thing. It was all of his, humanitarian foreign policy abuses that he should have been impeached for. In this case, I really wish Tulsi Gabbard had taken a stronger position. I mean, she made a lot of headlines by her present vote. She was one of like 3 people to break reins on the voting here. Everybody else voted along the party lines with no Republicans voting yes. So I think she had a real opportunity to score some points and, not even necessarily focus on the whole house can't divide against itself can't stand and that, the articles here are kind of weak. I think she really could have hammered it home saying that, look, if we were impeaching this guy on Yemen, if we were impeaching him on the drone wars, if we were impeaching him over, unconstitutionally expanding the war in Somalia, his drug war in Afghanistan where they just started bombing drug targets, which aren't really military targets, and killing a whole bunch of civilians there. I mean, I'm sure she could point to some immigration stuff that most Democrats would agree with her. And these are, I think, serious abuses. Things that are, actually meaningful, harming the world and not Donald Trump's, talk, with Zelensky. In fact, I think the fact that he actually authorized additional military aid to Ukraine, something that Obama had been reluctant to do and had not done, is a far more problematic decision than his decision to withhold that aid because, supporting the Ukrainian military, that is supported by, right-wing extremist kind of factions, including and up to followers of, neo-Nazi, Stefan Bandera. Now, one of the things that comes out as, Congress is having their whole big debate, this big show here, where everybody comes up and gets a little, video soundbite of themselves saying, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, either Donald Trump is the most abusive or the most abused president in the history of the United States. And you're very proud to either be voting for or against this resolution and its historicness and all that other crap. I'm sure that's going to play well when they're, sending out little fundraisers and trying to get Twitter likes, and get reelected. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not like an actual debate where the Democrats and the Republicans are going up there actually trying to convince each other of anything. Everybody kind of knew the game that was being played there. One of the things that comes out in all that, though, is that the Democrats are really just impeaching Trump here for Russiagate. It's this whole general conspiracy thing that they now have against him. I guess what happens is that the plan all along was to use Mueller to indict Trump, but Mueller fell so flat on his face they couldn't. And then this was kind of the closest thing that was also scandalous to get Trump on. And of course, it kind of went along with the establishment foreign policy, which I think is part of this whole idea that they're trying to hem in Trump, and keep him on the establishment warmongering foreign policy that has, raged since the end of the Cold War. I think it's a mistake though, and I think it's very dangerous and possibly going to get Trump reelected. And it's a really scary thing, to think about another term of Donald Trump, another term of Russian interference and all this, other, hawkish nonsense. But, man, this Russiagate thing is also falling apart at the same time that they're hinging their own case on it. So we had the Horowitz reports come out, and I don't want to talk about too much on the show because me and Joanne Leone spent a lot of time breaking that down through a Bob Barr interview. Everybody check out the latest Swapcast I did with Joanne Leone for that. But I do want to talk about this interview that James Comey did on Chris Wallace's show about the Horowitz report, where basically, Chris Wallace, who is a very kind of mainstream guy, slams James Comey for, a whole bunch of abuses in the FISA process here, and, saying this whole investigation, the Crossfire Hurricane and the Russiagate investigation was all bunk and nonsense. Really highlighting the fact that they abused Carter Page and it violated his human rights and constitutional rights with this investigation. And a FISA court judge has even come out and said something. They're so upset with the FBI over it. If you want more on this, there's great breakdowns by both comedians, anti-war comedians on the right and left, Jimmy Dore, Jimmy Dore show, and Part of the Problem, and that's the great Dave Smith. All right, I want to move on from impeachment and Russiagate to talk about the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. Has now passed the Senate, will be signed by the president. A couple things that will happen once he does is he'll have to apply sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is going to bring liquefied natural gas into Europe. The U.S. worries that this will make Europe too dependent on Russia, although it will lower their energy prices and probably make their economies more prosperous. So it seems like, this is just kind of a mercantilist type policy the U.S. is trying to enforce to keep Europe relied on American natural gas that's a little bit harder to ship because it has to come by ship rather than pipeline. Germany says they will not retaliate against the U.S. for these sanctions and thinks they possibly will be able to complete the pipeline before the sanctions actually take effect anyways. And what could possibly be something positive in the 2020 NDAA, although I am skeptical if this will amount to anything, is it does require the Director of National Intelligence to release a report on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. We have seen the intelligence community come forward and point the finger at Saudi Arabia. So anything to tarnish the reputation of Saudi Arabia in the United States is a good thing. Of course, the focus should always be on the war on Yemen and the need to end that. But since that doesn't really capture headlines, and if the Director of National Intelligence would point the finger at the Saudi royalty and the king and crown prince there, that's something that we could use to hopefully one day end this war in Yemen, even if it's not necessarily about Yemen. It again tarnishes the reputation there. While the U.S. is going to spend now another $738 billion on this, just being the Pentagon budget again, the actual defense spending budget's about $1 trillion once you factor in all the debt and everything every year. We're going to add $1.2 trillion to the national debt. And, with very little conversation about this bill that's 3,500 pages long gets passed by, both houses of Congress while everybody's talking about impeachment. So, nobody's read this and is looking into it. They're all focused on impeachment. Something positive going on in both the House and Senate as bills have been introduced to push Trump towards renewing the New START treaty with Russia. This is a critical treaty that caps the number of deployed nuclear arms that both countries are allowed to have, I believe, at about 1,500. The Trump administration has been fairly negligent on having any kind of negotiations with Russia here and has this poison pill type position that the Chinese have to be involved for the U.S. to renew it. The Chinese nuclear stockpile is about 300 weapons, while the U.S. and Russia, I think, have, again, 1,500 deployed. They also have thousands in reserve. So the Chinese are saying that there's no reason for them to enter in any arms control with powers that have, thousands or tens of times more weapons than them. All right. So, on to Korea here. With South Korea, the U.S. is again having problems, negotiating how much money South Korea is going to spend, pay the United States for the U.S. 20,000 or so soldiers deployed in, Korea. I believe under the Trump administration, the number started at about 700 million. It increased to $1 billion. The U.S. is now asking for $5 billion. This is, I guess, pretty standard Trumpian negotiating procedure. Ask for absolutely everything and then end conversations when the other side won't give you what you want. So talks have stalled. The South Koreans are saying, I guess they're not going to pay more than the billion. We'll see where the number ends up. Last year, the negotiations went well into the next year, and then they kind of made the payment retroactively. I don't think this is going to be the issue that actually withdraws U.S. troops from South Korea. So, as I talked about in the beginning of the show, there's this coming potential crisis in North Korea where Kim Jong-un has given the United States till the end of the year and has now talked about Christmas to engage in meaningful negotiations with the North Koreans around their nuclear program, but has already put out that, hey, denuclearization is off of the table. You would hope that the U.S. would reach out and try to engage in some nuclear negotiations, but reasonable ones is kind of the key point here. The U.S. position throughout pretty much the entire negotiations is that North Korea has to give up everything up front. We've seen through the Iran deal that the U.S. really doesn't commit to their nuclear deal, so it seems unlikely that the North Koreans are going to go for this. Again, I think, and this is something I've kind of brought up in, probably the past 100 or so episodes of the show, this misunderstanding or the two different understandings of this deal signed at Singapore highlights the difference between the two sides here. The U.S. says that North Korea has to begin destroying their nuclear program, and then the U.S. might start relieving some sanctions, and North Korea says that the U.S. needs to end its hostile policy, start diplomatic negotiations, form ties, and then, in step with sanctions relief would come North Korea getting rid of, destroying some nuclear facilities and stuff like that. I'm expecting in the next week or two to see some kind of major test by North Korea, or some people have possibly talked about a satellite launch. My guess is this kicks off a period like we had in 2017 that is at least very hawkish rhetoric exchanged between the U.S. and North Korea. Russia and China are pushing for some sanctions relief for North Korea in hopes to get talks restarted. I don't think the U.S. is going to consent to that. The sanctions at the UN, I believe, had to be repealed by the UN Security Council, which means the U.S. will at least have to not veto it, and there's no indication that will happen. The State Department number 2 and U.S. envoy to North Korea, Stephen Biegun, traveled to South Korea and had some talks there, made the statement that if the North Koreans will engage in talks, they know how to contact the U.S. Not a great sign that the U.S. isn't going to reach out a hand and at least make one last effort to have something done here. And again, offer the North Koreans some kind of, even if it's a first kind of small step deal, that could actually make some progress. Moving to South America, children are increasingly the victims in Venezuela, not only of the socialist government there, but also of the U.S. sanctions that I'm sure are starting to bite, causing more unnecessary suffering. We had some economists in the past year come up with this 40,000 number of deaths that the U.S. sanctions contributed to. That's likely only growing at this point. The Trump administration is now considering taking more hostile positions against Venezuela at a time when support for Guaido, that's the coup government that the U.S. has backed there, is pretty minimal. In Venezuela, it seems extremely obvious that Maduro will hold on to power. Trump's now considering a possible oil blockade there, which I'm sure would create conflict and more suffering for the Venezuelan people. In Bolivia, the coup government issues an arrest warrant for the former president Morales. He is now living as a refugee in Argentina. Their evidence is that there was a phone call that Morales was on giving instructions where to set up blockades after he was removed from the country. There's a video of somebody talking on speakerphone. The evidence seems pretty thin here, and even international sources like Reuters are pointing out that there's no verification of that video whatsoever that was Morales on the line. Trump has voiced his support for the coup government in Bolivia, and there's been some good reporting at the Gray Zone by Jeff Sprague about the deep ties between the heads of the coup plot and the United States. Looking at Europe, NATO received its second of 5 Global Hawk spy drones. These could hover for 30 hours at a time and have all kinds of surveillance equipment on them. Of course, they're way past due. They were all supposed to be delivered by 2017. Now the last of the 5 is expected to be delivered in 2022. The drones are going to cost NATO $1.5 billion. This is, again, just a welfare payment to the military-industrial complex. The Spanish government continues to repress the people of Catalonia in their bid for independence. Spain's High Court found that Catalonia's current leader, is guilty of disobedience, as disturbing as that sounds, and this could be punishable by removing him from office and preventing him from holding office for 18 months. So the story that's unfolded over the past couple of weeks, there's this Latvian businessman named Avers Lemberts, and his family is apparently very wealthy and has a lot of control over Latvia's second largest port. The U.S. didn't like this guy, so they sanctioned him. Latvia then passed some laws and seized the port from him, and then took it over, and the U.S. removed the sanctions. So this is just one example of how U.S. sanctions can move international and different countries' policy. In India, there's these protests springing up over a proposed law that will grant citizenship to all non-Muslims from neighboring countries currently living in India. The Muslim people obviously feel this is discriminatory and a demographics war against them. With increasing protests in India of the Muslim minority against the Hindu majority there, there's always a risk of great oppression and crimes against the minority, as well as different, not that it's all one-sided. Certainly even in the Kashmir region, there's a lot of activity and, extremism by the oppressed minority. Moving on to Afghanistan, the Pentagon has been pretty dismissive of the Afghanistan papers. This was a big drop by the Washington Post, obtained through a FOIA request that basically, just reveals that the whole time the government has known the Afghan war has been a failure. The rest of us have known the rest of the time. And then with this war being a failure, it's just so sad that it continues to drag on. But now we have another 10 members of a family killed by a roadside bomb. Moving around the Middle East here, and I'm going to try to get through these stories fairly quickly. Israel, a power company there, has cut off power to some areas of the West Bank for 3 hours a day over what they say is a Palestinian electric company's missing debt payments. I talked about on the show a couple weeks ago how there's been tens of billions of dollars taken out of the Palestinian economy over the past couple of years by the occupation of the Israelis. And so, this isn't a situation where somebody is legitimately indebted to somebody else, but, this is an oppressed people who are now having their power cut in winter. The people in the West Bank suffer. The people in the Gaza Strip suffer more. Israel has barred all Gazan Christians from traveling to holy sites in Israel and the occupied West Bank in the next year. This includes like Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The GCC dispute that started in the first couple of months of the Trump administration, I believe it was May of 2017. Now looks like it may be moving towards an end. The Qatari foreign minister in Qatar is the country that's been blockaded by its Arab neighbor Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is now meeting some and says that the stalemate with Saudi Arabia has been broken. The Saudis are launching a massive lobbying effort in the United States, $1.5 million. A disturbing statement by Steve Mnuchin, who is the Treasury Secretary, said Iran's attack on the Saudi oil facilities was an attack on the world economy. This seems like the kind of language that they would use to justify some kind of action against Iran. Well, yes, it is an attack on the United States and our interests as it's an attack on the world economy. The U.S. House and Senate has passed a bill that recognizes the Armenian genocide. This is a big issue in Turkey, and in a move at pleasing Turkey, Trump has said he is not going to sign that bill. In the first half of 2020, the U.S. has cut its State Department presence in Erbil by just over 100 positions. About a quarter of the staff will be removed there. You should read the article that I'll link to in the show notes page about it. Of course, they're hysterical about the embassy staff dropping, but this isn't even the largest U.S. embassy in Iraq, and they're only removing just a chunk of the embassy staff. part of what we're seeing in Iraq is something that we saw, and is revealed in the Afghanistan papers, that the humanitarian projects, just lead to additional corruption and everything. And while I don't want a bunch of U.S. State Department officials in Iraq, probably the more that are being removed, the more this aid is just being kind of dropped and thrown around because you have to spend the money, likely leading to more corruption in Iraq. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper called on Iraq to stop attacks against Iraqi bases that are housing U.S. soldiers. I mean, part of this is, well, don't you think they would stop attacks on their bases if they could? So I don't know what the Secretary of Defense is calling on Iraq to stop it. But if the U.S. starts taking action here, this could be problematic because it seems like the U.S. is at least looking at the Iranian-backed militias as being responsible for these attacks. As far as I'm aware, none of these attacks have killed an American, and I'm not sure if any have been injured as well, although some Iraqi soldiers have been injured in these attacks. In Yemen, in the city of Hadida alone, 799 civilians have been killed in 2019, and this is, despite a ceasefire agreement coming at the end of 2018, just, I guess, kind of showing how ineffective the UN effort has been there. Although the UN is continuing with their effort, now holding talks between the Houthis and the Hadi government, that's the Saudi and US-backed government of Yemen, in a ship off the coast of Yemen. A few stories in Africa I wanted to get to. The U.S. is claiming to have killed one person in Somalia. They say it is a member of Al-Shabaab, without providing any evidence. The Somalis have been complaining throughout the Trump administration, especially, that our drone strikes and airstrikes are killing civilians. And yet the Trump administration every time just says either Al-Shabaab or ISIS were killed. Turkey seems ready to deploy some forces to Libya there to bat the internationally recognized government. I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper show on this soon. I know I've talked about it in some detail in the past, but what exactly Turkey has plans for in Syria, what their government's there doing there, and what government they're backing there, and what that means. The army of Haftar is once again marching on the capital city. This is the Libyan strongman who opposes the internationally recognized government and is backed by, people like the UAE, France, Russia, and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Libya's southern neighbor, Chad, had an attack by Boko Haram kill 14 civilians. What were identified as Islamist militants in Niger killed 4 humanitarian workers who had previously been kidnapped. Militants in the Congo killed 22 people. Militants have killed over 150 people since in October the government there started anti-militant operations. This has started to hamper Ebola treatment as the outbreak there has now killed over 2,200 people. And last, the former dictator of Sudan, Bashir, has now been sentenced to 2 years in jail for corruption. Thanks everybody for tuning into the show. I'll be back next week with shows. I think I'm doing a lot of interviews that hopefully will get pre-recorded before the Christmas week so I can take a little bit of a break. But nonetheless, I will have some content for you. Hope you're enjoying the show. Give it a rating and review if you like it. Share the show if you can. Find it online at the Libertarian Institute. The URL is libertarianinstitute.org. My Twitter page is at KYAAALE, and you could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.